Hi everyone, this is our lesson on gender and socialization. In particular, this is related to your readings for this week, and we'll focus a lot on hooking up and opting out, which is the reading that you had to do. One of the things that's really important to know that we talk about in general in sociology is this idea of socialization. Socialization is the process of inheriting and disseminating norms, customs, and ideologies. So, in other words, how we learn how we're supposed to behave or act. As I said in the previous video, when we talk about what does it mean when we say boys will be boys or girls will be girls? This kind of discourse creates a set of social norms that basically disciplines people who occupy those social categories into behaving a certain way. It also tends to socialize the idea of inequality, the idea that girls aren't strong enough, right, or aren't athletic enough, or that men who take on jobs like nursing, for example, are being more feminine. These are all socialization processes, in other words, things that we learn. Socialization can provide an individual with skills, habits, values, and beliefs necessary for participating successfully within their own society. So here's the other thing, is that socialization can be both positive and negative. How we talk with people, how we disseminate our ideas about social categories, they don't always have to be negative. In fact, we can flip things around and talk about it in a more sort of positive way. Now, specific to this week's lessons, I want us to focus on the idea of gender socialization. This is the process of learning the social expectations and attitudes associated with one's sex category. Excuse me. This occurs through such diverse means as parental attitudes, cultural belief systems, schools, how peers interact with each other, and mass media. So when I talk about this idea of parental attitudes or cultural belief systems, right, is that parental attitudes can be how do our parents talk specifically about the expectation for girls and boys. This is going to be a very specific sort of discussion when we go read next week's reading, Gender Spiritudes, We Don't Sleep Around Like White Girls Do. There, it's both about parental attitudes, about what parents think that folks should do, as well as cultural belief systems. In other words, how does your culture deal with the expectations of being a man or woman, boy or girl? We also know historically that schools play a very influential role in terms of how we internalize the understandings of gender. So, for example, in some schools historically, you'd have a boys' line and a girls' line. There would be certain activities that boys could participate in that girls could not, or vice versa. Maybe most notably is that we still see to this day young women being tracked, what we call tracked, in education out of the sciences. In other words, they're told early on, particularly maybe they don't do well in a science class, that they say, oh, well, just science isn't for girls. And so over time, these things create inequalities. And as we'll talk about in terms of socialization and mass media, in the movie that you're going to have to watch to do this week's work, mass media advertising also portrays a particular set of attitudes and ideas about how women should behave and how they're viewed by society. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the article Hooking Up and Opting Out. Now, on the one hand, I think it's important to note that it is a little dated, as in she was focusing in on a college-age group of kids. But that being said, I think that one of the reasons that I assign it is that I think that it really talks about this idea of how we think about the ways in which groups can talk about sex, right? And how it challenges the different social norms. Because we know 100 years ago, anyone, particularly women having premarital sex, right, that was very taboo. It wasn't allowed. It might have been slightly more permissible, not by much, if you were having sex with somebody who you were going to marry. But certainly this idea of more casual sex, right, where there was no commitment involved, was not considered an acceptable part of culture. So in the article, she talks about what is hookup culture, right? Hookup culture is defined as casual sex contact between non-dating partners without an expressed or acknowledged expectation of forming a committed relationship. Now, this is really important here in terms of a few different words I want you to make sure that we're talking about. It isn't actually just the act of sex or penetration in whatever form. She actually talks about sexual contact, right? Second, that they're non-dating partners. And third, that there is no expectation of commitment. These are the three conditions that I think are really important to look at. So a couple things I'm going to ask you to think about as you're reading this article. What does it mean when we say that there is a culture of hooking up? Is this a good or bad thing, and why would researchers study this topic? Well, number one, I want us to think about the idea of culture, which means that it's a set of norms and beliefs, right? It's not just a hook up, as in someone who is having casual sex contact, but that it is a culture, as in that there are norms, belief systems, protocols that one has to follow. And as we're going to talk about, the article that I'll talk about at sort of highlight level does have very specific opinions on the sort of implications of hookup culture. So according to Boble, hooking up usually happens in college. Communication is established through mutual attraction. They select a semi-private or private location, and participants don't stay the night. Now, this is where I would say that the literature is a little dated, as in I don't think hookup happens just in college anymore. In conversations and in classes that I've taught, students like you have all talked about the fact that this idea of hooking up starts even as early as junior high, maybe even earlier. Communication, right, is no longer just a person to person, but also involves different applications, right, on your phone. Tinder, for example, right? Swipe left, swipe right, whatever it is, right? This idea of semi-private or private location stays stays similar, as does the idea that participants don't stay the night. What's important to note is that in the article, she talks about hooking up existing within a broader context of shifting scripts on sexual norms and activities. This idea of shifting scripts on sexual norms and activities. What this is really talking about is what is considered allowable behavior. What are we more accepting of now than we were 10 years ago, 20 years ago, or 40 years ago? And I think that these are all questions that you can answer. Now, we know in today's day and age that there's all sorts of different ways in which we talk about the social norms around sex, right? Is there a particular date that you get to where it's expected, right? How does one ask for it? When we talk about, is there a hookup culture, right? We know that there's a sort of different parlance around it, right? You all probably know the newer sort of lingo around it, but it could be like Netflix and chill, or Hulu and hang, or whatever it is. There's all sorts of different ways that it's communicated, even very publicly, right, to others that you might be interested in having company. So in the article, we also talk about what were the respondents opting out of. Well, what we do know is that there are consequences to hooking up. And that if you read the article, and this stays similar today in the more recent research on hooking up and opting out, is that we do know that there are a number of different consequences. The research says it's pretty straightforward. It says, number one, we know that it's bad sex, right? It's not mutually gratifying, and only one person generally comes out somewhat satisfied. There are emotional and social outcomes. There are very similar emotional consequences for men and women, which can be feelings of isolation, not sure what it means, feeling disconnected. These are things that I expect you to be able to highlight, right, when you answer your questions for the week. We also know that there are different reputational outcomes. What this means is if you are a woman who sleeps around, right, and has multiple sex partners as compared to a man, how you're thought of is very different. We have a whole language around that a language instead of words that we call women if they sleep around and have multiple sex partners. They're a hoe. They're a slut. There's all sorts of different sort of words, right? And yet we don't have the equivalent sort of negative sort of ideology attached to men. They're a player, or historically they were called a gigolo, right? Whatever it was, is that it was definitely had a much more positive spin to it as opposed to a negative one. From a public health perspective, it's also important to know, and this research has been consistent over the last 15 years, is that there's a decreased perception of risk. In other words, the more casual one is about sex, we've also seen that they're more casual also about protecting themselves. And so what we've seen as a result of the sort of growth of hookup culture is an increase in STDs in individuals between the ages of 16 to 24. And so this in and of itself also has a very sort of particular dynamic that we want to be conscientious of. We also know that the hookup culture can lead to what we call self-objectification. This is a key process whereby girls and women learn to think of and treat their bodies as objects of others' desires. You should be able to pull some examples from the movie Killing Us Softly 4, which you're going to have to watch relative to the homework for this week. And there also is what some have argued, this sort of new narcissism. Narcissism is a self-centeredness with grandiose views of one's own talents and cravings for admiration. We see this like kind of in the selfie culture, right? Or this way in which we create an image of ourselves on social media, right? In which it can falsely inflate one's ego, right? And that the consequence is that we become much more self-centered. So why do researchers study hookup culture? Well, to understand the changing social norms around sex and intimacy, to understand changes and transitions in romantic relationships, and understanding both gender and sexual relationships. In other words, part of what we see, right, is that through this sort of process of hooking up, is that it makes explicit the kind of inequalities that exist. I think there are a couple of things I also want to point out about this study, is that it is told from a very heteronormative perspective. In other words, it assumes heterosexual relationships. But we do know that it isn't just unique to heterosexual couples. And that the sort of similar findings can be found across the board regardless of sexuality. Now, to do the homework this week, you're going to have to watch Killing Us Softly 4. And in this particular one, it's important that you take a look at the socialization of gender roles and gender-based stratification, and the fact that it happens in very seamless ways. In the movie you'll watch, it also is associated with this week's assignment. It will talk about the way socialization occurs in advertising. And so I'll come back to this particular movie again next week in terms of next week's lesson on feminism. So one of the things that's also important to note is that the sort of shifting social norms has a very particular set of consequences. And what we've seen sort of across the board is in the increase of sexual harassment that occurs. I think it's important to know, right, that if you don't already know these rules already, is that sexual harassment is unwelcome sexual advances, requests for sexual favors, and other verbal or physical conduct of a sexual nature that includes quid pro quo harassment or hostile workplace harassment. So quid pro quo harassment basically says that you submit to such conduct is made either explicitly or implicitly a term or condition of an individual's employment. In other words, if you do this for me, right, or if you sleep with me, if you kiss me, whatever, then you will be given job X. Submission to or rejection of such conduct by an individual is used as a basis for employment decisions that affecting such an individual. So kind of from a more stereotypical standpoint, the scenario you might think of is the proverbial casting couch for actors and actresses, or really actresses, where the idea is that the actress would only get the job is if she slept with the director or producer, right? And unfortunately, we do still hear a lot about quid pro quo sexual harassment. Now, the second type is hostile work environment. This is such conduct has the purpose or effect of unreasonably interfering with an individual's work performance or creating an intimidating, hostile, or offensive work environment. Here, it's that you can't even go into work without someone being hostile towards you, catcalling, making remarks, creating an environment where it's toxic to even exist, where you feel that you can't conduct your daily work without having this individual make remarks, etc. One of the things to think about, can a person give a consent if they're drunk? Can a person give consent if they're high? If you're in a committed relationship or previously hooked up with an individual, does this mean you automatically have consent to have sex? If a person goes into a room with you and initially seems interested in having sex and then changes their mind and says no, is this consensual? If at any point an individual says no, even if the act of sex has already commenced, is it a consensual situation? Pretty much the answer to all of this is no. So it's important to note, what is consent, right? Number one, we live in the state of California. And yes, we must abide by the yes means yes law. In other words, we are a two-party consent state. An affirmative consent is standard in the determination of whether consent was given by both parties to sexual activity. Affirmative consent means affirmative, conscious, and voluntary agreement to engage in sexual activity. It's the responsibility of each person involved in the sexual activity to ensure that he or she has the affirmative consent of the other or others to engage in that sexual activity. Lack of protest or resistance does not mean consent, nor does silence mean consent. Affirmative consent must be ongoing throughout a sexual activity, can be revoked at any time. So if at some point, even if you're in the act of intercourse, someone can say no and that stops being consensual. If you are drunk or high, you by law cannot give consent, right? And so if either or both parties are drunk or high, then it is not a non-consensual situation. And the existence of a dating relationship between the persons involved, or the fact of a past sexual relations between them, should never be itself assumed to be an indicator of consent. It just means you had a relationship with them before. So this is what's important to note, right, is that consent, right, is that yes means yes. And so these are things that I think are important that we often lose sight of. So that's the sort of lecture for this week. Make sure you do the readings and watch the videos associated with this week's assignments.